You've probably never heard of half the fruits that helped families survive the Great Depression, and your grandparents could grow them in their own backyard. Let's get into the fruits that fed a generation when grocery stores weren't an option. First, we're going to start off with Pawpaw, which happens to be considered the poor man's banana. So this is something you'd usually find in river valleys, wooded areas, and the kind of terrain people most commonly associate with the Appalachian foothills, right? You'd find Pawpaw growing all over Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky, and you can still find it growing today. It's not exclusive to those areas either, because if you go over southeast and further still to the deep south, you'll see the same. Pawpaw trees happen to thrive in rich, well-drained soil. You'd usually find that near rivers and pawpaw trees took years to grow, so people were really strict about not cutting them off. Now, eating these was a pretty good idea. They were rich in calories, carbohydrates, and natural sugars, so for people who didn't have a lot of meat, which was pretty much everyone, this was a way to get by. Not just that, they also filled in for some of the stuff you'd usually get from meat, like magnesium and iron. It's important for your immune health, and in those times, you really wanted to avoid getting sick. If you don't have money for food, how are you going to get a doctor? But hey, let's say you don't happen to have a couple of handy rivers to water your soil and grow your trees and food naturally. What do? In wetlands in the deep south, people often ate mayhaw. It was pretty typical swamp fare too. Mayhaws would grow best in flooded woodlands and swampy riverbanks. You'd think nothing worth eating would grow in an environment like that, but their natural resistance to wet soil ended up making them ideal for it. It also meant that they were great for foraging during the Depression because, despite the harsh conditions, these fruits were some tough customers. They would still stay edible. They were resistant to disease. They could still serve in low-quality acidic soil. And when you ate them, you didn't have to just settle for some fruit you picked up from a swamp. You could actually make jelly out of mayhaw, which helped people stretch their supplies and save their strawberry jam for when it really counted. They were low-calorie, so they weren't that good for energy like Pawpaw, but they were pretty medicinal. They came in handy in folk remedies for heart health and circulation. The biggest reason people ate these was probably because they came in early spring, and besides, the sigh of the small red fruits ripening was relieving to some. Now, Medlar is something that people were unfamiliar with unless they were from Europe. It was a lot more common to see it there than it was in the United States. Medlars were the opposite of both. These little fruits would love rocky soil, which meant that they were great winter fruits. You'd see them in the northeastern areas the most. What they were also really good for was providing some much-needed fiber. Now, fiber's good for keeping your belly full, but it's also invaluable in helping digestion and preventing anemia. When people ate things back then, they didn't think of just how they tasted, how they'd help the supplies last longer, or how they'd save money. They also thought about what each fruit could do and its different benefits. People would use the tannins of medlars to help treat diarrhea too, which really goes to show you how innovative people were during the Depression. The next time your grandpa tells you to just figure it out, maybe he's talking from experience. The Depression era wasn't a time that was marked just by economic ruin, but also environmental destruction thanks to the Dust Bowl. A lot of soil was damaged, so fruits like persimmons, which thrived in poor soil, became essential. You'd see these growing on rocky hillsides, and true to the brand, they were rich in minerals, particularly potassium, which helped when bananas weren't around. They also packed quite a lot of vitamins A and C, which helped keep cases of scurvy in check back in the day. However, that was only the tip of the iceberg. Persimmon could offer more than just basic nutrition. They were good at keeping you active and providing you comfort. How did they do this, you ask? Persimmons, at least fully ripe ones, are incredible sources of sugar. Just one contains the equivalent of a modern energy bar. When people would go out foraging, especially in the Midwest and Southeast where persimmons were naturally growing, they'd always keep an eye out for them. You could also make pudding out of the fruit, which was a real comfort for people who hadn't had something like that in a while. The seeds were also really helpful because when you roasted them, you could ground and brew them as a substitute for coffee beans. So, all in all, this was one fruit you always wanted in your bag, no matter what your situation was. Mulberries were considered a superfood for foragers. They were one of the most invaluable fruits throughout the entirety of the Depression. Mulberries, whether the ones that grew on native red mulberry trees or the white and black ones, which you may be more familiar with, were extremely common. Not just throughout one region or vast expanse of land, but throughout the nation. They were also rich in carbs, which made them one of the best sources of energy. It didn't stop there. They were packed with valuable vitamins, iron, manganese, and sugar, which helped keep people's health strong in tough times. It would especially help in keeping away the effects of starvation. It was also normal for people to have issues of inflammation thanks to their poor diets, rough environments, and labor-intensive jobs. Mulberries were a local remedy for them, whether they were eaten fresh or used in the form of preserves. It helped to keep a stash of mulberries for tough times. Most people just ate them as a snack throughout the day, but it was the fact that they were incredibly easy to grow and adaptable to most kinds of soil that made them such a strong pick for everyone's grandparents, not just ours. Gooseberries, on the other hand, were picky. They only flourished in a specific kind of environment, and that was the unforgiving, harsh cold, particularly the kind you'd find near the rocky foothills of the Northeast. They weren't sweet, but while I have been mentioning how some of these fruits were rich in vitamin C, this one is a whole other animal. It's got more of the stuff than an orange, which meant that it was crucial in preventing vitamin deficiencies. It helped keep your autoimmune system strong. And why was this so important? It was because back in those times, even the tiniest of infections could have killed you, stuff that we'd at best call in sick for or visit the ER for. Still, their benefits weren't all just practical. You could make an incredible pie out of gooseberries. Mixed with some brown sugar or just natural sugars obtained from other fruits, they were a joy. It was especially nice to have them because they were one of the few kinds of fruits that had pie potential while still being able to survive in the cold. Elderberries in North America were some of the most foraged fruits to ever make a name for themselves in Depression history. They were found throughout much of the eastern stretch of the United States. Elderberries were tough and resilient, and they were the kind of fruits that enjoyed climates no other crop or fruit would take to. You'd find elderberries growing alongside the strangest of places: fence sides, abandoned fields, roadsides, and rocky cliffs that just didn't have anything else growing. Elderberry bushes had grown to become super adaptable. They could handle a lot of droughts, and trust me, there was more than enough of that to go around. They could stand in the rain for days, no problem. As long as they got enough sunlight, they were easy to grow. Families could maintain steady supplies every year without any kind of effort or diligent care. Elderberries were kind of like a stew in a slow cooker. You'd just leave it for a couple of hours and come back to a great little meal. The berries themselves were incredible antioxidants. They were essential in managing colds and flu, especially in young children. Besides just their extensive medicinal use, the flowers of elderberries were something that people used to make teas, cordials, and fritters. Sometimes people even sold wine or syrup they had made from elderberry. It had become a reliable source of quick change at a time when that was hard to make. Quince was a Depression-era fruit that didn't have its own success story like most of the fruits we've discussed. They were considered inedible most of the time. That is, until people learned how to cook with them. Once people discovered that they were actually amazing when prepared, public opinion shifted positively. Quinces, eaten in their raw state, are a real challenge. They're extremely hard to bite into, possess a strange tannic flavor that leaves an aftertaste you'd rather forget, and they don't feel good to eat. It's only when you cook them that the diamond hidden beneath all that pale, yellow-hued exterior begins to peek through. Sorry, they're quite yellow, in case you've never seen one. When cooked, though, they actually turn pinkish red, almost like a rose. Not only that, they have hints of all the right flavors. I'm talking tart notes as you bite into it, along with hints of vanilla and an aroma similar to honey. Sounds like a dream, right? It truly was. Cooked quince felt like the perfect blend of apple, pear, and rose, making it amazing for different kinds of preserves and jellies, as well as various poached fruit dishes. Some people did enjoy them straight after cooking, but most liked to experiment with what could be done with them. How often would you find a fruit that was so versatile, pretty, and delicious all in one? Crabapple is probably not a name you've ever heard of. I wouldn't blame you either. Personally, I find it hard to keep track of my own cousins, let alone fruits. But they actually are wild cousins of your typical apples, and they grow throughout pretty much everywhere. Crabapples don't really look anything like an apple, though. You'll find that in terms of size, they're pretty modest, not really packing much. Your typical grocery store cherry or plum probably has them beat by a few inches. What it lacks in size, it makes up far too much in terms of sourness when you eat them raw. Of course, no one was ever picking these things for cheap, bitter masochism. They made fresh-pressed juice and fermented hard cider out of crab apples. How did they have the idea to take advantage of the fruit's natural acidity? It's beyond me. But crab apples provided a lot of much-needed sustenance to many rural communities. In terms of nutrition, they were pretty much ignorable on their own, though people made a habit of eating their skins for the antioxidants. It's when people would pair them up with other fruits and juices that they would really shine. Some things are meant to have a supporting role, you know. Now, the chokecherry, on the other hand, was a berry that was a bitter pill to swallow, but one that you most definitely would swallow. Not only because most days it was one of the only fruits around, but also because you'd find it just about everywhere. From the Rocky Mountain ranges to the Great Plains and everything in between, chokecherry was an established local resident of almost every square foot of American land. These small, deep red berries grew in these clusters on some really rough shrubs and small trees, the kind of thing that evolved to adapt to the harsh conditions it was always finding. You know what I mean? It's not something that people would struggle to forage, but it is something that people have a lot of issues eating. See, the reason they began to be called chokecherries is because of how much people would gag when eating one. They were just that bitter, and no amount of time being slow cooked in a pot waiting for the boiling to happen would help that. Chokecherries did have a lot of medicinal uses, though, and that's also why they were sometimes sold. People wanted the bark of chokecherry trees for teas that could help with cough remedies. The berries themselves helped reduce digestion issues by a lot, and in general, they were excellent for your gut health. Huckleberries were one of the most prized wild berries you could find during the Depression. For people who grew up living in the mountainous regions of the Pacific Northwest, it was a treasure fruit. These little bastards were related to blueberries, but they had a more intense flavor than blueberries could ever hope to have. Huckleberries ranged from sweet to slightly tart-like, but they always had wine-like notes. Sounds luxurious, right? Huckleberries were really cultivated. They were almost entirely harvested in the wild and used in domestication, making them a really prized treat. Huckleberries were packed with all sorts of nutritional content too. Vitamin C, manganese, you name it. They were scarce, with an explosive and strong flavor. They were also a cash crop. During peak harvest season, foragers would go out in droves to pick out huckleberries, even going deep into the mountains to get a good haul. They'd sell these at local markets or to restaurants instead of hoarding it for themselves. But when they did, people made pies and syrups out of it. Sometimes they sold that too. Other times, people kept what they had made for themselves and their family. It became common for huckleberries to even become somewhat of a currency in some places because of their potential for bartering. Osage orange, also known as a hedge apple or a horse apple, isn't really a fruit that's meant to be anywhere near your stomach. That doesn't mean it can't be useful, though, and that's exactly what happened during the Great Depression. It was a fruit that was native to Texas, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. People planted it outside of those areas too, but in these ones, the potential for foraging was much higher. The Osage orange trees on which these grew were actually a part of the natural layout of the land, acting as organic fencing. That is until barbed wire became more common, and development meant that a decent amount of them were cut down. These were green fruits filled with latex, and that made them a poor choice for eating, but sometimes you could give it to your cattle and pigs. Still, Osage orange was most known for its wood, which is extremely durable and rot-resistant. Osage orange wood was used to make bows, doors, tables, tool handles, and even fence posts. Families would cut and sell this wood for the decent amount of money you would make, as even despite the Depression, demand for this was always there. Ground cherries were known as husk tomatoes. They were something that most people only knew about if they were around in the Depression. It's an unusual-looking fruit, golden, small, with an awfully fragile-looking husk. Ground cherries were something that could be best described as unique. They looked unique, they felt unique, and they tasted unique. The taste is something I'd say is similar to a blend of vanilla, citrus, and pineapple, as conflicting as those flavors might sound. Unlike a lot of fruits, though, ground cherries were something you could eat right from the get-go. Found one in the wild? All you had to do was pluck it out of the husk and eat it. It used to be an incredible foraged snack for children and other adults. They could be used to make jams, preserves, and even pies. After all, with something that tastes like this, you'd obviously want to see what you can make out of it, right? Depression-era cooks often made recipes like ground cherry pie, and the best part was this was a pie that took very little sugar because of how naturally sweet ground cherries were. Nutritionally, ground cherries were something that had a lot of beta-carotene. This is vomiting that does two things: support your eye health and boost your immune function. Why did you need good eye health? They didn't have screens to get addicted to, right? Well, you'd be surprised what living in polluted environments and working in them too can do to your eyes, and people who could see usually did a lot better than those who couldn't at finding resources in the wild. Saskatoon berries, also known as service berries or June berries, were a fruit that was most commonly grown in the Rocky Mountain foothills and the northern plains. Thriving in harsh conditions, these shrubs preferred dry and sandy soil as opposed to anything with rich, nutritious value, for plants. However, just like the people themselves, this fruit was a symbol of resilience. It's something that would grow no matter how beat down the environment was, and man, Americans were identifying with that sentiment. Saskatoon berries weren't just good for symbolism, they were a proper health-boosting superfood. They had incredible amounts of fiber, iron, and manganese. Usually you find a fruit that has all three of these. It doesn't really add up too much, and there are fruits food besides that offer more, even if they may not have everything the fruit does. With Saskatoon berries, that wasn't a problem. It had a combination of nutritious elements you would want, and it had a staggering quantity of them too. Saskatoon berry jam was also a favorite of the people, both for selling in local markets and for personal use with your family. Black hawthorn berries weren't really well known. They were a useful wild fruit, sure, but that was just in limited places in the Northwest and Northern Rockies. Besides just not growing in too many areas, and thus always staying in the background, black hawthorn berries started to become a reliable source of easy food during droughts. What was even rarer than the knowledge that they existed was the knowledge of how to cook them. Black hawthorn berries were something that you could make jelly and jam out of. Most people would boil them down until the natural pectin was released. Then, they'd mix them with fruits that were significantly sweeter, such as apples, Saskatoon berries, and chokecherries. Some others also used black hawthorn berries for cooking sweet sauces. They would strain the pulp out, though. It's a universally hated experience. They can be used for medicinal tea, and hawthorn berries were something that most Depression-era families can look back on very vividly. Loquat berries were known as Japanese plums, and they actually became an extremely valuable fruit, particularly in the areas of the South and along the Gulf Coast. They were a California favorite, but they didn't get their start in America. These were a fruit that became popular after having been brought on over from East Asia. Loquat trees weren't as adaptable or resistant to tough climates and environments as the other fruits on this list. Most loquat trees needed warm climates and thrived in well-drained soil. One of the best things about them was that loquat trees would ripen in early spring, and that would make them one of the first fruits you could pick up in the new year. Lots of people also made loquat jams out of these, as the tardiness of the jam was something that was entirely unique. It worked in pies, too. It just wasn't as common. When you would stew or can it, families would add just a bit of water to make compost that could be eaten with bread and other fruits. People found all sorts of uses for them, really. Aronia berries were known as black chokeberries. They were a tenacious fruit that you would find most commonly in acidic soils, cold climates, and poor dry land. This made them the kind of thing that most people wouldn't ever think about growing, But chokeberries happened to be so naturally resistant to their bottom-of-the-barrel surroundings that when they did get planted in decent soil, the results were almost staggering. Most people would dry out their Aronia berries and store them for future use, especially throughout the winter months. These dried berries were often added to oatmeal to make a more filling breakfast. Aronia berries became known for their tannic structure, which made them perfect for fermenting at home. This meant that you could produce wine out of it, and it was actually pretty sweet. People even sold it for a pretty penny, at least whatever was considered a pretty penny back then. Prickly pear fruit, also affectionately known as tuna, actually happens to grow from a cactus, whether or not you can believe it. This fruit loves Texas, and it's a certified Texan in its own right. Besides that, you'll see it in New Mexico, Arizona, and California. During the Depression, fresh fruit was so rare in these regions, but prickly pear fruit gave people an alternative way to have accessible nutrition. The fruit thrived in extreme heat and poor soil, and that's really just what made it so good for the southern climate. You could forage it and farm it on dry land. Seeing one of these deep red or yellow-green, depending on the area, was a sight for sore eyes. It wasn't edible off the bat, though. You had to remove its spines. The fruit was harvested using tongs and gloves and then singed over a fire. It would be rubbed with a cloth to remove tiny little spikes before people peeled it. It could be made into juice or syrup if you mashed it, extracted the juice, and then made syrup or drinks out of it. It could also be put into storage for months that would be sun-dried or made jam and preserved out of it. There were a lot of uses, and not only were they nutritional and medicinal, it gave you lots of fiber and kept your blood sugar in check. It also became a valuable bartering item because of how accessible it was to people living in the areas I mentioned. The Mulberry Fig Hybrid was an odd one. It was a mixture of mulberry and fig trees that had both been cultivated throughout several parts of the Midwest and South. During the Depression, people even planted these along roadsides or in their own victory gardens. Mulberry Fig Hybrid trees are not a naturally occurring phenomenon. They were entirely made by Depression-era gardeners experimenting with grafting techniques. It let them combine mulberries with the syrupy nature of figs. These grafts didn't give you a proper hybrid, it wasn't possible to. What they did do, though, was give you both fruits on different branches, which, I don't know about you, is just as cool to me. Mulberries had this mildly tart sweet flavor, and the fact that it was grown on this draft tree gave them an entirely new flavor. The same went for wigs, which had a honeyed sweetness to them. You could eat these fresh, you could make jam out of them, or you could even bake and make cakes out of them. It's really just the versatile nature of this gardening technique that makes it so worth noting, though. You get twice the fruit, twice the benefit, and all you have to do is simply plant them together. Autumn olive, also known as the Elaeagnus umbellata, which sounds either like a Harry Potter spell or the title of an obscure Barbie movie, is not an olive. This is a small red berry with tiny silver speckles that grows on a shrub that's got a hankering for nitrogen. It was something that wasn't native to our land. It was introduced originally by Asian immigrants. Ever since that, autumn olives have spread rapidly across the eastern and central U.S. They thrive in the kind of climate most other fruits would die in. Despite that, it's considered an invasive species because it takes up space. During the Depression, though, people really did not like risking it. A failed harvest would mean terrible things for you and yours, so it was a lot easier to just go with the kind of fruit that you knew would work. The berries would also ripen all the way in the late summer to fall. Taste-wise, they were reminiscent of cranberries with a bit of pomegranate thrown in. They were eaten fresh, but they were used more for bartering. It's because they were easy to gather in large quantities, and they were also a great supplement in diets. People used them to boost their immune health, which helped things. Buffaloberries, on the other hand, were a vital food source for people who had been living on the Great Plains. They were the kind of fruit you would see in North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Nebraska, and Wyoming, which aren't rates we've mentioned so far, right? While most of the fruits on here prefer acidic, moist soil, this one wants to be different rapidly, so it picks dry and alkaline soil. Every family has one of those, you know? Anyway, indigenous communities had been planting buffalo berries since way before the Depression. It was a common harvest for foragers and homesteaders. They were either red or yellow, and they had an intensely tart-like taste. What you couldn't do was just eat them right off the bat, though. They had to be made into jelly, dried, and ground into pemmican, which was just mixing it with animal fat and dried meat. Besides that, people made buffaloberry pudding out of it. Both of those dishes are indigenous recipes, and they involve maximizing their energy gains. Pemmican has animal fat and dried meat mixed in, making it an incredibly high-energy food. The pudding is something that gets turned into a frothy pudding by whipping it enough with sugar. People used to call it Indian ice cream, if you can believe it. All of these things were bartered because it was rare to see them in the Depression in those areas. Barberry was a widely available fruit that was actually seriously underrated. It wasn't as commonly cultivated in the United States. The barberry species that were consumed were usually found in abandoned homesteads, hedgerows, and rural landscapes. Barberries liked rocky soil that was poor in most regards. Maybe you can ask your grandparents what they know about barberry and report back. Barberries were actually these small, bright red fruits that grew in tightly packed clusters. They had a really strong tart flavor, with a citrus tang. Barberry had always been used in medicinal medicine as well, along with the bark and the roots. The berries contained a lot of berberine. I know that sounds like a Pokemon, but bear with me. This was a compound that was known for its antibacterial properties, and during times of illness, families would often brew barberry tea to help with digestive issues and help boost the strength of their immune system. That's really just what most of these fruits could do. Give you a few vitamins, help you with some burning pain, but overall, just make you stronger and disease-resistant from the inside. Calicarpa americana, known more commonly by the name of American Beautyberry, was a very useful wild fruit. And yes, before you wonder, they did look incredibly pretty. They were bright purple berries that were easy to spot from a mile away, and I'm not entirely sure if that's the reason they got the Beautyberry name, but who has a better guess? These were most commonly grown in different parts of Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. It was something that thrived in different kinds of environments and was not as naturally tart as barberries. You could still make it into jelly when you mix it with sugar and lemon juice. It would help the mild flavor take on a more floral taste. The jelly was beautiful, though. It was this vivid, deep purple that made it just nice to look at. What most people don't talk about when the topic is Depression-era food is that these people still were familiar with the concept of presentation, yet none of their food was reflecting that. Most of the Depression-era food just doesn't look appealing, even if it does taste nice. Yet we aren't here for the aesthetics. This fruit had a lot of practical benefits. It could be made into teas and infused to help aid digestion. It could be used as a mosquito repellent, preventing the spread of harmful diseases. The leaves of the berries would be rushed and rubbed on the skin so that mosquitoes would not be attracted to you, and it was a common trick known in the South. Nannyberries were a really valuable fruit. When nannyberries would be fully ripe, they were inherently very soft and sweet. This made them a wonderful snack for nomadic tribes, farmers, and foragers. People going on supply runs would always try to pick out nannyberries wherever they would find them. Nannyberries looked like small blue plums with a black tint, and they were something that ripened in late fall. They had a very unique flavor and texture as well. The soft, custard-like sensation you would get when biting into it, along with the fig-like taste, made it a very lovable fruit for many. Plus, these were a good source of energy and fiber, meaning they kept you more active and full for longer, and during a hard-working day in the Depression, which was just every day, what more could you ask for? Hackberries were known as sugar berries. They would typically be crushed under a person's teeth so that the protein and fat-heavy seed could be consumed. Or they would be ground into powder and added to porridge or made into nut butter. They could also be turned into pemmican, and they were exceptionally nutritious. These bad boys had carbohydrates, fats, proteins, calcium, and iron packed into one. That made them a superfood during the Depression, and one that people always kept their eye out for. Hackberries could also be stored for months on end without being spoiled, and so when people would not have a use for them food-wise, they would barter them or barter the powder, paste, or pelicans they would make out of it. It had an unusual build, too. Thin, sweet skin, a little bit of pulp that you could eat, and a really hard seed in the dead center. It had a nuttiness, but you had to have some dog-like teeth to be able to bite through the seed and crush it. Hoover Stew was one of those dishes that anyone could afford to make, so it is no wonder that the stew was a common item in the Great Depression. Hoover Stew had two signature traits. It could feed the whole family, and you could have the dish without exceeding the monthly budget. As for the recipe, the dish involved using scraps and leftovers to increase savings and recycling in a time when households could not afford a lot. You did not need many spices, and you could easily use leftover meats. In an America where banks were going bankrupt and the job market was hopeless, the stew was a welcome addition. Obviously, it would be a popular choice among many households, as our older viewers might still remember. Fortunately, as economic stability came back, Hoover Stew went away from tables in favor of more flavorful and varied stews. Let's start the video with everyone's favorite peach cobbler. Whether made with fresh, juicy peaches at the height of summer or canned peaches during the off-season, this dessert never failed to bring warmth to the table. Grandmas have always been great at making those labor-intensive meals, but this one was a laid-back treat that they whipped up in minutes. Yeah, even you can make it. Just take a few peaches, toss them with sugar and spices, and top with dollops of biscuit dough. This one was served best with a side of vanilla ice cream. Some grandmas even added a splash of bourbon to make the cobbler extra special. Plus, this dessert became so popular that there is even a day dedicated to it. April 13th is National Peach Cobbler Day in the United States, so mark your calendars and call your grandmas for some childhood nostalgia. One of the finest dishes we ever got as a result of the crock-pot was the famous Amish 6-layer dinner. Just like Kentucky Fried Chicken gets a lot of attention for those infamous 13 secret ingredients, this dish too only has 6 ingredients that make up all the magic. You have your onions, ground beef, carrots, tomatoes, and then a layer of seasoning and broth. You layer this up in a casserole dish, bake it until the vegetables are the definition of soft and tender, and enjoy the healthiest and tastiest casserole you've ever had. Simple does it, right? That advice has carried kings to their empires, and it'll carry you to a wonderful dinner if you take it. You don't need to pre-cook anything, as everything goes into one casserole. This dish gets the Amish association because, as you may have guessed, it got pretty popular in those communities and places with farming traditions. More people started adopting it when people had an interest in the many cuisines that different communities in America had, like the Amish and Midwestern traditions. The era where this dish got popular, the 1950s to 1970s, was a time marked by an increasing population and birth rate. People had larger families, and cheap, affordable ways to feed everyone were immediate hits with the masses. So, canned mincemeat was something you'd get for dirt cheap. I'm talking about barely 25 to 30 cents, which puts prices today to a world of shame. But who's comparing? I am. It hurts. We used to be a proper country. Boomers really did enjoy that time, and I can't blame them. You get chopped meat complete with spices and aromatics for that price, and you start to realize why and how these people were making pies every day. Anyway, you want to take a guess at how the mincemeat craze really started? When canned food first started appearing, the whole idea here was to advertise it in a way that really sold the "you don't need to work for your food anymore" factor. They'd say things like this'll help keep the wife out of the kitchen, and people would just eat it up, literally. Then you start having things like televisions roll around, where people largely just moved to things they could easily eat while watching and didn't take a long while to make. And you get how mincemeat became the iconic canned food it is today. Mock apple pie is another delicious dessert that clicked with masses across the nations during rough times. As apples were getting expensive, people were looking for cheaper alternatives. That is when the mock apple pie entered. Resemblance is one thing, but if the pie looks and tastes like it, then it might as well be an apple pie. Created using cheap and the nation favorite Ritz crackers, mixing those with some vanilla syrup, sprinkle some lemon and cinnamon to create a perfect home-baked pie fit to rival apple pie. The Depression era onwards really saw an explosion in its popularity. We cannot really blame people either. Fresh, juicy apples were in hot demand and short supply. The pie was just as cheap as Hoover Stew and easy to make. Nowadays, of course, you would not find this in houses you go to, despite it being popular enough that Ritz had instructions on the back of the box on how to make it. Speaking of nostalgia, nothing brings back childhood memories of visiting Grams quite like some old-fashioned bread pudding. Every time there was stale bread on the counter, we knew Grandma was going to make some delicious bread pudding. This dessert became known as poor man's pudding because it was affordable. The best part about this one? You could add your own twist with toppings like raisins, chocolate chips, nuts, or fruit. While Grandma's bread pudding might have a classic American twist, this dish had international cousins. In France, it was known as pain perdu, which meant lost bread. In the UK, it was sometimes called bread and butter pudding. And in Mexico, there was a version called capirotada, which was traditionally eaten during Lent. Sadly, we're in the era of croissants and pastries, and this simple sweet treat can't compete with the fancies. Still, if you've got some bread, milk, and sugar at home, there's no better or easier way to use up the leftovers. Dust off your grandma's old cookbooks, and you might just find her exact secret recipe. This is probably the best proof of how stress-free a crock-pot can be. When your cooking gets so simple that your dish gets called no-peak chicken because you literally don't need to even glance at it, you know you need to invest in one of these bad boys. This dish takes chicken breasts and works some real magic with them, but the real star of this show is the canned products. Canned mushrooms and soups are put into a dish with a broth, then covered with foil and baked. The rice absorbs all the liquid, and the chicken soaks in that lovely flavor. It gets really mushy in the process, and that means it's perfect for you to sink your teeth into after a long day. It got popular because it was one of those dump and bake recipes. It took nothing. You wouldn't work up a sweat making it, and everything you needed for it was available at your nearest convenience store. Casserole culture in general started skyrocketing from the 1950s to the 1980s, and this was one of the staples of that time. It's a win-win situation for everyone when your country's classics are made even easier and more accessible thanks to nifty new machines, and people definitely took as much advantage of that fact as they could. But if you think that's all they had, you're sorely mistaken, my friend. Sometimes boomers would get tired of the regular routine and switch it up with Armour Star's barbecue ribs in a can. Yes, actual, well-made, pre-cooked saucy pork ribs in cans. These were meant to last and were made in a way that helped extend their shelf life. Ever wonder where the whole idea of preservatives started from? So, by the time of the 1940s and 1960s, the entire population had pretty serious battle scars from the Depression. Years of living off of crumbs and government rations will do that to you. What that did do was create an extended effect where even after peacetime began, people were still living by their frugal habits and mindsets. Everyone wanted what would save a buck, and canned food producers took note. Then came the cornmeal mush, joining pies and stews on the list of economically sensible lunches. When times are tough, porridges become a very enticing meal, as affording bacon strips or other meats for breakfast was out of the question. Even if you got cheap beef jerky, you did not know if it was good and clean meat, and typical American breakfasts like grilled bacon and eggs were losing popularity due to price constraints. People needed their 7 a.m. nutrition, so cornmeal mush, an incredibly healthy dish, became popular. Topping the cornmeal with maple syrup, or in some cases a thick sausage gravy, elevated it in the taste department. It was not much of a fan favorite though, because the mush did not last long after the economy settled. Once people could afford better, they definitely went back to their regulars. We've got all sorts of fancy pies nowadays, from chocolate hazelnut mousse to blackberry merlot, but Grandma's banana cream pie was the talk of the town in the 60s. Do you remember coming home to a chilly slice of this delicacy? This one was a guaranteed crowd pleaser, and that's why it was the star of the table during the holidays. Here's the thing, bananas were very readily available in the US in the 1950s till 1960s, which means people had to come up with creative ways of eating them. And well, grandmas know best, especially when it comes to hearty desserts. The post-World War II era saw a boom in convenience foods and desserts that were easy to make at home, and banana cream pie fit perfectly into this trend. This wasn't just your favorite dessert. It was reportedly a favorite of President Harry S. Truman, who had a sweet tooth for simple, homey desserts. There was also a no-bake version of the banana cream pie, perfect for summer days when turning on the oven wasn't ideal. We're going to continue the casserole show with Alpine Chicken. This one got popular for more or less the same reasons the other two did. However, it had an extra kick that they didn't, and that was the addition of Swiss cheese. Americans will never get tired of a dish if it has a decent helping of cheese in it. So you shouldn't be too surprised that this is stuck in the minds of eaters and families like glue. Alpine chicken typically uses cream of mushroom soup and breadcrumbs or a stuffing mix layered in a dish that gets cooked until the cheese is melted. You also have your typical chicken breasts involved, but some people go for the thighs. It peaked in popularity during the post-war era when people really started looking for more ease in their cooking rather than sweating buckets after a day in the kitchen. You know how when you cook something, you rarely feel like eating it immediately? It's because cooking is a soul-sucking endeavor. It doesn't have to be, thanks to things like crock pots and recipes like Alpine Chicken, which bring the fun back in food and make sure you actually get to rest and replenish that stamina tank. Plus, this was a dish that really got the crowd singing, and that's always one you want to keep on your roster. Now, who could ever forget Campbell's soup? This is a household staple if I've ever heard of one, and it's a pretty magical thing when you think about it from the boomer's perspective. Today, we're spoiled. Let's face it, we are. We walk up to a store and get anything we want packaged, canned, or frozen, but all these goodies started somewhere. And Campbell's Soup was one of the most popular and long-lasting brands to do it. It had this condensed soup that just needed water or milk added and came in accessible flavors like cream of mushroom, chicken noodle, and tomato. The range with this thing was insane. Did you know you could even use this soup as the base for a casserole or as its sauce? And all that for just 10 to 12 cents. Pretty good steal, right? Considering it wasn't just a meal, it was a lifesaver for busy moms and a comforting staple for families during tough times. The iconic red and white can became a symbol of good food, finding a place in nearly every pantry. Campbell's ads even taught clever recipes like turning cream of mushroom soup into a creamy pasta sauce or a gravy for meatloaf. Dandelion Salad might sound like a fairy tale-like name for an incredibly frugal but delicious meal. By now, you might have noticed the scavenger vibe in terms of ingredients of the dishes so far. People making anything out of whatever they had on hand. Economic downturns often feature lifestyle changes, and the Great Depression was no other, sending people on a scramble to find and eat anything. Dandelion Salad took scramble seriously as the meal involved finding and foraging dandelions. You would cut out all the roots, flowers, and waste to make the dressing for a very healthy salad. For people, especially those on a diet and a budget, this was a godsend. For a garnish, all people would usually put on it was lemon juice and olive oil, a dash of salt, and you were good to go at basically no cost. Many great things have come out of Alaska, but nothing beats the baked Alaska grandma would bring home on the weekends. If it doesn't ring a bell, let me jog up your memory really quickly. This dessert was made of ice cream placed in a pie dish, lined with slices of sponge cake or Christmas pudding, and topped with meringue. Now, don't let the name fool you. This delicacy didn't really originate in Alaska. Yeah, it was made at the famous Delmonico's restaurant in New York City. The dessert was supposedly named Alaska, Florida, in 1867 to celebrate the United States purchase of Alaska from Russia, with the cold ice cream representing Alaska and the warm, baked meringue representing the sunny state of Florida. This one is known for its dramatic presentation. It was brought to the table aflame with a flambe. Many grandmas love to make baked Alaska for special occasions because of its wow factor. This dish actually got popular for exactly the reasons you would think. Yes, landing your man through a happy stomach is a good way to get married by fall season. Land your man, baked beans suddenly are a tried and tested method. I mean, you don't get a moniker like that for nothing, right? These typically get served as a topping for bratwurst or hot dogs, or served as a side for a main event that lies more on the barbecue side. The beans are made with ground beef, onions, and bell peppers, so they definitely are the perfect side to any kind of savory or tangy experience. One of the best sauces to use was Texas Pete sauce, but Any kind of Tabasco works. If you have hardwood smoked bacon, though, that's definitely what cookbooks recommend, along with Taco Bell seasoning. As far as beans, any kind of canned beans work, but if you're looking for a specific recommendation that really encapsulates that mid-1900s flavor profile, then you should go for Bush's original baked beans. Either way, you're in for a great time with these. Try making them for a special someone on a romantic evening, and maybe you might get lucky in other ways too. Speaking of casserole, this one's a mouthful to say, but trust me, it's worth the effort. Neo-Life. Nest Dehydrated Stroganoff Casserole was this pre-made mix that just needed water added to it so you could get rid of that icky dehydration part of the whole deal. I get why they did it, because canned food that can't last is like a fish that can't swim. Kind of redundant, so it's all right. Plus, this thing always gets a pass for how close it actually came to imitating the flavor of a real casserole made from scratch. You had a creamy, beefy stroganoff cassie, which you could obviously tell is processed, but for what it was worth, which was just $1 or $2, and the amount of value you got out of it, nobody was complaining about a little bit of a powdery aftertaste. Stroganoff is definitely something that was more popular in their time, though. Have you eaten much of it? Or is it something you regularly get a plate of? Vinegar pie is the rather odd dish on this list that proves that at times of desperation, anyone will eat anything. Vinegar pie started spreading infectiously out of states like Pennsylvania in the start of the 1930s and tops even dandelion salad when it comes to being budget-friendly. All you would need is an open crust, vinegar, sugar, and some eggs to create this unique pie. To cover the mediocre taste, people would coat the crust with a meringue. It was an affectionate treat to bring in case of a celebration and was easy to make if you had a sweet craving. The dish was also pretty delicious if you were able to get over the sour vinegar taste and focus on the meringue. People really wanted a sweet treat at the end of a hard week spent cutting corners and working long hours, and small joys like vinegar pies were what kept people sustained. Well, rice pudding is also one that wasn't just delicious, but also healthy. Don't you love it when sweet treats come with health benefits? Talk about a good deal. So, I'm sure I don't need to get into the nitty-gritty of this one, because who doesn't remember the taste of rice pudding? It started out as a way to use up leftover rice and soon became the dessert that had everyone coming back for seconds. Not only this, but rice pudding was one of the easiest desserts to make and was made with ingredients easily found around the house like rice, milk, and sugar. Rice pudding originated in Europe and was brought to the States by European immigrants. Our grandmas decide to take the classic dessert up a notch by adding some key ingredients like vanilla, nutmeg, maple syrup, or cinnamon. Now, with the change in tastes and trends, this one never made it to big restaurants, but let's be honest, Grandma made it better than any Michelin star chef could possibly have. It's something about making sweet treats with a whole lot less sugar and a whole lot more love. If you do hear wedding bells because of this dish, know you did a great job. Pork cassoulet was what you went for as far as everyday meals go if you wanted to work some pork into the weekly diet. Pork cassoulet featured pork shoulders, or sausages in particular, and some of the typical ingredients you're used to seeing with savory dishes. Tomatoes, onions, garlic, all your usual suspects, except this time it uses white beans like Great Northern beans. The reason you ended a crock pot, particularly for this, is that it is a stew, and the pork needs to be browned. Now you can include breadcrumbs for a crunch on top, but it kind of messes with the stew-centric vibe, so people used to leave them out. As far as the flavor goes, this is all savory, and it does not hide that fact from you at all. The slow cooking really lets everything combine into one massive profile that feels like it's made up of many different flavors, instead of a lot of tastes fighting for which one gets to stand out the most. When this was popular, pork was leagues more affordable than it is today, and the fact that you could either make this into a stew or a casserole meant that a lot of families found a lot of use for it. It fit the tastes of almost every prolific area in the country, like California, the Pacific, or the South, and it did great at keeping everyone full. Throughout the Depression, the war, and every little bit of chaos after, canned bread was a constant friend, ally, and supporter of the American people. This dense, sweet, and spongy bread used to get that way thanks to a neat little trick known as steaming before canning, which really helped it retain that airy, sponge-like texture. This was used in war for soldiers as a part of government rations, and even organizations like the Red Cross would have it during many of their food drives. For just 20 or 25 cents, you could get some pretty decent bread, and the entire idea of this was to market how practical and convenient it is. I gotta say, it worked because people bought it in droves. Seriously, go ask your mom and dad about how much people used to get canned bread back in the day and how it was used for rations. They pretty much paired it with things like Campbell's soup or used it as a side for other dishes that involved bread. Not everybody even had an oven back then, and in an era with an increasing focus on hustling and grinding your way into a nice little retirement, the appeal of baking bread from scratch for a few hours wasn't really something people were too into. Potato pancakes are one that we are very sad to have seen fade away from the arsenal of home chefs. Pancakes made with matzo or applesauce topped with garlic or fried onions made for such a mouth-watering meal. Low-income households back in those times were struggling to buy produce. Farmers' markets were uniformly unaffordable for middle-income households due to creeping inflation. People needed a vegetable that was cost-appropriate and easy to make in batches. Enter the potato pancake, which revolutionized the breakfast scene in a struggling time. As times improved, people slowly started going to more fancier and creative breakfasts, unfortunately leaving simpler dishes behind. Potato pancakes took a backseat in the face of changing food and economic trends, but anyone from the era will rave to you about the godsend these were. You can't possibly have a conversation about forgotten grandma desserts and not bring up the infamous blackberry cobbler. This one was a summer favorite when blackberries were in season and at their peak of flavor. So, cobblers have their roots in early American history. Pioneers who traveled across the country had to make do with what they had, and traditional pies were difficult to bake on the road. Instead, they would cover the fruit with a layer of biscuit dough or batter and cook it in a Dutch oven, creating what we now know as a cobbler. The blackberries didn't only give the cobbler some flavor, but also packed it with antioxidants. This dessert was particularly famous in southern states and was a staple at many southern family gatherings, church picnics, and barbecues. If we take a look at how porcupine meatballs made their claim to fame, then the answer is pretty easy, my friend. You take canned food, a sauce that gets simplified for everyday use, and budget-friendly, high-quality meatballs, and you have an easy winner in the eyes of the people. This dish costs nothing to make and requires the simplest of things from you. It's probably all stuff you already have in your home, to be honest. How often do we really find ourselves without any onions or rice? The sauce might be a bit tricky if you're new to it, but any canned tomato sauce would work too. All in all, it's extremely beginner-friendly. It caught on because between the casseroles, the meatloafs, and the pot roasts, people needed something different, but similar enough that it could work for them on a daily basis. What they ended up finding was porcupine meatballs, among many things, but the recipe is largely forgotten nowadays. You just don't get to see it being made much in households, probably because the prices are much higher than they used to be, and because there's been a massive rise in takeout culture on top of it all. Its golden days in the 1950s and 1970s are ancient history now. Now this one's really going to blow your mind. Imagine a world where you can get Monarch Alaska King Crab for just 50 cents, or max $1. See, that's my kind of capitalism. These days you go out on a date, and the idea of either of you ordering the crab really sets your finances back for the remainder of the week. Back then, it was literally in abundance. I mean, you couldn't go a day without your friendly neighborhood fisherman catching a fat, juicy crab that was just begging to be boiled. Of course, that meant that canned crab was an idea that wasn't too far down the pipeline. It was made to preserve the sweetness we've come to love crab for, and it was used in all kinds of dishes. Crab casseroles, salads, as a dip, or even crab sandwiches. The options were pretty broad. I gotta say, it must have been easy to keep in shape when all the protein you could ever want is that easy to get. How about you? Think king crab something you'd fill your cabinets up with if you were born back in our parents' days? Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. Feeling like your taste buds aren't being represented so far? Don't worry, we have a can for everyone, even the pickiest of eaters. Okay, so this next dessert's reputation speaks for itself. I'm talking about Snickerdoodle cookies. This bad boy was timeless. You could be 5 or you could be 45 and still enjoy the soft, chewy Snickerdoodles coated in cinnamon sugar, which gave them a sweet, slightly spicy flavor. And trust me, it was impossible to resist. Snickerdoodles are considered a classic American cookie, with a history that dates back to the late 1800s. 2 centuries later, they're still a fan favorite. Now, you could get these at many popular bakeries, but nothing beats what Granny whipped up in minutes back in the day. This biscuit was the star of Grandma's cookie jar, and always the first one to disappear. As far as everyday meals go, it gets pretty hard to outdo candied carrots if you're a middle-class home in the mid-1900s. As I'm sure many of you can relate to today as well, the little goblin in your brain that demands a sugar rush every other day for comfort is something humans throughout time have experienced. How did they get their fix? Well, you couldn't just get a caramel mocha frap from Starbucks like today, but you could take some carrots, boil them, and coat them in a glaze that was made from honey, maple syrup, brown sugar, and butter. Not really something that would suit the tastes of today, right? But don't knock it until you try it, because it actually did really well. Candied food was this entire niche genre of cooking back then that got popular. The whole glaze aspect was something people loved applying to every dish to see what sticks. These were a side dish that also worked for kids, so they got a lot of mileage out of family gatherings and dinner parties. But even besides that, it's still a great way to work some carrots into your diet. As far as the taste goes, they definitely hit home. It feels like any other treat you'd be eating, though when we think of candy today, we might be more used to hard and mushy textures like in hard licorice or sour candies. This was tender though, and it would melt in your mouth. This time around, we're going to talk about the miracle that is canned rice pudding. Sweet, creamy, and topped with just the perfect amount of cinnamon, vanilla, or nutmeg. This was the definition of a no-effort meal. I'm not joking around when I say all you needed to do was grab a spoon and rip that can open. As far as desserts went, it was pretty hard to compete with this 20-cent wonder and how much of a chokehold it had on the market. You could make more fancy desserts out of it, or you could just stick to the rice pudding, but for $1, you had pretty much your entire family fed. See, that's the economy we signed up for when we thought I'd grow up and get a job. I get that we can't print more money and all, but is bringing back affordable rice pudding too much to ask? Sometimes being a boomer doesn't sound so bad. What about you? Think you'd settle down in another era if you could savor all the food we don't have anymore? Prune pudding was one of the more niche dishes that were created during the Great Depression. What really was surprising was that prune pudding extended to the upper royalty as well, since even prominent VIPs would also be real low budget with how they eat. Prune pudding became very popular as a result of the efforts made by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who would serve prune pudding at White House functions. It stained the White House's culinary track record, sure, but earned massive points with the struggling American people. For being made of such a simple ingredient and some syrups of your choice, it was definitely one of the tastiest and cheapest meals to come home to. Next up, we gave the rhubarb pie. This is another one of Grandma's treats that wasn't too sweet or heavy on the stomach. It was a springtime hit made with fresh rhubarb sugar and often a touch of cinnamon or nutmeg. Rhubarb grows abundantly in gardens, and this recipe was the perfect way to use it up and celebrate the flavors of the season. Remember when we'd wait all year long for spring to come just for a slice of this one? Well, some grandmas canned or froze the rhubarb to use throughout the year. Rhubarb is naturally quite tart and can be too sour to eat raw. In pies, it was typically paired with sugar to create a more palatable and balanced flavor. Grandmas often experimented with different amounts of sugar and other ingredients like strawberries to complement the tartness of rhubarb. As goofy as this name sounds, and please bear with me because I really can't say spork and speef without chuckling, it was actually a legit idea for an afternoon lunch. Before that though, let's get into what it is. Spork is basically just canned processed pork, and beef is exactly the same. But beef? I want whoever named these to win some kind of award. I'm not even sure if there's a category for best product names out there, but if there is, this guy should win. Luckily for this, the name wasn't the only thing it had going for it. It was really a lot like Spam, and it was affordable, easy to take around with you in your bag, and even easier to prepare since it was all pre-made. We're going to go into it in detail later, but this was really similar in texture and taste to Spam, just minus the tropical elements. It was a shelf staple. If you had a can of this and 2 slices of bread, you could pretty much make a sandwich today. See all those 10-step sandwich recipes on TikTok that ask you to go get a giant loaf of bread? Out with that, in with this. Bring back convenient sandwich making. Plus, Speef and Spork were really good because they were so versatile. It was even a competitor to Spam because you could pretty much pair this with any classic breakfast or dish that was typical for Americans and get to eating. It was a great way to liven up some meals that were otherwise good but had gotten pretty monotonous thanks to being such regular mainstays at American tables. Speef was definitely the better option for families though, since it was a mix of beef and pork sometimes as well. You could make some banger casseroles off of this. That wraps up the sweet and innovative fruits our grandparents used to fight off starvation in the Great Depression. Comment which fruit is your favorite, and don't forget to like and subscribe.